Myrtle Maddox stepped off the stagecoach into the blazing afternoon sun of Caldwell, Kansas, 3 weeks and 2 days late, with a carpet bag in one hand, a crumpled letter in the other, and the absolute certainty that the man who had agreed to marry her had long since moved on with his life. The town of Caldwell in the summer of 1878 was not a gentle place to arrive looking weary and uncertain. Dust hung in the air like flour shaken from a sack, coating every surface with the particular pale gold that the Kansas plains seemed to produce in inexhaustible quantities. The main street ran straight and honest, flanked on either side by storefronts with painted wooden signs, a saloon already busy at 3 in the afternoon, a dry goods store with bolts of calico visible through the window, and a livery stable at the far end from which the smell of horses drifted warm and not entirely unpleasant. Men in wide-brimmed hats moved along the boardwalk with the unhurried purpose of people who belong to a place. Women in practical cotton dresses carried baskets or stood talking in the shade of the general store awning. Children ran between legs without apology. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they were supposed to be. Myrtle did not. She was 24 years old, brown-haired, and possessed of brown eyes that people back in Missouri had called warm when they were being kind and serious when they were not. She was not a small woman nor a particularly large one, but she carried herself with the straight-backed posture of someone who had learned that if you looked like you knew what you were doing, people were less likely to ask questions you could not answer. That posture had served her well on the journey west. It had gotten her through a flooded river crossing at Independence that had delayed the first stage by 4 days, through a broken axle outside of Wichita that had cost another 3, and through the kind of sustained discomfort and anxious uncertainty that would have sent a less determined woman back to her mother's house in St. Joseph without a backward glance. Myrtle did not have a mother's house to go back to, which was partly why she had answered the advertisement in the first place. She stood now on the dusty street and unfolded the letter she had read so many times the creases were soft as cloth. It was written in a careful hand, neither elegant nor clumsy, the hand of a man who had taught himself to write well enough to mean it. The advertisement had been straightforward. A rancher outside Caldwell, Kansas, established in business, Christian in faith, 30 years of age, seeking a wife of good character and steady temperament, willing to work hard and make a home on the frontier. The name at the bottom of the letters that had followed had been Paul Shelby. They had exchanged 4 letters over the course of 2 months before Myrtle had agreed to come west. His letters had been honest in a way she had not expected. He had not described his ranch as grand or his life as easy. He had written plainly that the work was hard, the winters were cold, that he had been without a companion for long enough that the silence had started to feel louder than any noise. He had written, in the second letter, that he was not asking for a woman to be a decoration or a servant, but a partner, someone who would share the weight and the occasional great beauty of the life he was building. Myrtle had read that letter 3 times and then written back saying she would come. She had been supposed to arrive on the 12th of June. It was now the 5th of July. She tucked the letter carefully back into her bag, squared her shoulders, and looked up and down the street for someone who might point her toward the Shelby ranch. The rational part of her mind, the part that had kept her functioning through 3 weeks of delays and dwindling funds, and the particular exhaustion of uncertain travel, told her clearly that Paul Shelby would have given up on her. Any sensible man would have. He had likely written to the agency already, asked for a different woman, perhaps even found one. 3 weeks was a long time to wait for a stranger who might simply have changed her mind. The other part of her, the part that had read his letters until she knew them by heart, the part that had noticed how he described the way the light came across the plains at evening like something that deserved to be appreciated rather than taken for granted, that part was still hoping. She crossed the street toward the general store because people who sold things always knew who lived nearby and what was happening to them. The store was cool and dark inside after the blazing street, smelling of dried herbs and tobacco, and the particular dusty sweet smell of sacked grain. A woman behind the counter looked up at Myrtle with the frank, assessing gaze of someone who catalogued newcomers by profession, not unkindly, simply as a matter of practical information. "Help you," the woman said. She was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, with iron-gray hair pinned back severely and eyes the color of creek water. "I hope so," Myrtle said. "I am looking for the Shelby Ranch. I believe it is somewhere outside of town. I was supposed to arrive 3 weeks ago, and I imagine I may need directions and possibly also a moment to prepare myself for the conversation." The woman behind the counter studied her for a long, comfortable moment. "You are the mail-order bride," she said. It was not a question. "I am," Myrtle said, and there was no point in being delicate about it. "Paul Shelby's been in here twice a week every week since you were supposed to arrive," the woman said. "Checking the stage, checking the post, asking if anyone had heard anything." She leaned her elbows on the counter. "You want some water before you go out there. You look like you have been traveling hard." The kindness of it nearly undid her. Myrtle accepted the water with both hands and drank it slowly. "He has been checking," she said when she put the cup down. "Every week," the woman confirmed. She held out a hand. "Clara Hatch, my husband, runs the livery." "Myrtle Maddox," Myrtle said and shook it. "I have been late arriving due to circumstances that were genuinely beyond my control, but I am aware that does not automatically make them understandable to a man who was waiting." "You want my honest opinion," Clara Hatch said. "I believe I do, yes. Paul Shelby is one of the most patient men in this county. He is not always easy, and he is not always warm, because that ranch is a hard life, and it takes something out of a person to run it alone. But he is honest and he is fair, and he has been waiting for you like you were worth waiting for." She reached under the counter and produced a small paper bag. "Take him some of these peppermints. He has a weakness for them, and it will soften whatever conversation you have to have." Myrtle took the peppermints. She paid for them with the last of her small coins, thanked Clara Hatch with genuine feeling, and walked back out into the July heat to find someone with a horse and a willingness to show her the way. It was a man named Hector Reyes who ended up riding with her as far as the Shelby fence line. He worked at the livery and knew the road well. A young Mexican man of perhaps 20 who handled horses with the comfortable ease of someone raised alongside them. He did not ask her questions, which she appreciated, but he did tell her that the ranch was about 4 miles out, that the grass had been good this summer, and that Paul Shelby had recently fixed the barn roof after a hailstorm had done damage in May. "He is a good man?" she asked as they rode. Hector considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "He pays on time and he treats his horses well," he said. "In my experience, those are 2 things you can trust." The Kansas plains stretched out on either side of the road in every direction, vast and golden and breathing gently in the afternoon wind, the grass moving in slow waves that did make it look, as Paul had written in his first letter, like the land itself was alive and thinking. The sky was enormous, blue from horizon to horizon, with white clouds building in the west that might mean rain by evening. Meadowlarks called from the tall grass. A hawk hung motionless against the blue, watching something in the distance that only it could see. Myrtle had grown up in the cramped company of St. Joseph, Missouri, a river city with noise and commerce and the smell of the Missouri River always somewhere underneath everything else. She had not entirely understood, until this moment, what Paul Shelby had meant when he had written about the silence feeling louder than noise. Out here, the quiet was a presence. It was not the absence of sound so much as the presence of something larger and more fundamental, the sound of the world existing without any particular reference to human concerns. She thought she might understand it, given time. Hector left her at the gate, a simple wooden structure with a fence running away from it on either side into the grassland, a fence that had been built to last rather than to impress. He pointed her down the track toward a cluster of buildings perhaps half a mile distant, tipped his hat, and turned his horse back toward town with the comfortable efficiency of a man with more work to do. Myrtle sat her borrowed horse for a moment at the gate and looked at the ranch. It was not large by the standards she had heard described. There was a main house, a barn, a smaller outbuilding that might have been a smokehouse or a tool store, a corral with several horses moving lazily in the late afternoon heat. The house was built of wood and was neither grand nor mean, a working structure with a covered porch that ran across the front, a proper stone chimney, and a garden of some kind visible on the south side. It looked like a home someone had built with their hands and their care over several years. It looked like the beginning of something rather than the finished product of something. It looked, she thought, honest. She nudged the horse forward through the gate. Paul Shelby came out of the barn before she had covered half the distance, which meant he had heard the horse, which meant he was the kind of man who paid attention. He stood in the barn doorway with one hand resting against the frame and watched her come, and she watched him watching her, and neither of them said anything until she had brought the horse to a stop perhaps 20 feet away. He was tall. She had not entirely gauged that from his letters, though he had mentioned being tall enough that the door frames on older buildings sometimes required his attention. He was lean in the way that men became lean who worked outdoors through every season, not thin but reduced to the essential, with broad shoulders and the kind of arms that came from years of actual labor rather than the performance of it. His hair was dark brown, and he needed a haircut, and his face was the sort of face that did not immediately tell you what it was thinking, which Myrtle had always found more interesting than faces that told you everything at once. He was looking at her with an expression that she could not quite categorize, not anger and not relief and not indifference, something more complicated than any of those things. He was 30 years old, as he had said in his advertisement. She put that together with his face now and thought that 30 looked right on him, like he had earned it. She climbed down from the horse with as much dignity as a woman could manage after 4 miles on a road she did not know, adjusted her hat, and looked at him directly. "I am Myrtle Maddox," she said. "I was supposed to be here on the 12th of June. I understand that it is now the 5th of July. I have had every reason to believe that I would arrive to find you had made other arrangements or simply decided this was not something you wanted to continue, and I would not have blamed you for either of those things. But I am here now, and I thought the least I owed you was to come and explain in person rather than write a letter." There was a pause that lasted long enough for her heart to do several uncomfortable things. A horse in the corral shifted and blew. The wind moved through the grass. Paul Shelby came down the 2 steps from the barn doorway and walked toward her, and she held her ground because she was not a woman who stepped back from things, and he stopped a few feet away and looked at her with that unreadable expression and said, "3 weeks is a long time to wait for someone you have never met." "It is," she said. "I had about decided," he said, "that either something had happened to you or you had thought better of it. I could not figure out which one worried me more." She blinked. "You were worried about me. I had been writing letters to you for 2 months," he said, with what she would come to understand was characteristic directness. "I knew more about you than I know about half the people I have lived near for years. You become interested in a person when they write to you honestly. I did not want something bad to have happened to you." Myrtle felt something in her chest shift, like a door opening that had been stuck for a long time. "I was delayed by a flood, and then a broken axle, and then a dispute at the last station about a fare that I was certain I had already paid, which cost me another day and a half. I have documentation of all of it if you want to see it." "I do not need documentation," he said. "I thought you might want to know I had not simply changed my mind without the courtesy of informing you," she said. "I did wonder about that," he said. He looked at her steadily. "I decided you were not that kind of person. You decided that based on 4 letters. I decided it based on the way you wrote them," he said. He stepped back slightly as though remembering himself and gestured toward the house. "You have had a long ride. Come inside and sit down. I will put some coffee on." She looked at him. You are not going to turn me away. Something crossed his face then, brief and warm and completely unguarded, the first crack in the composure. I just told you I had been checking the stage twice a week since June, he said. Why would I turn you away now that you are actually here? She picked up her carpet bag, which she had carried since St. Joseph, and which she had come to regard with a mixture of affection and irritation, and followed him up the porch steps and into the house that would, she thought, perhaps become hers. The inside of the house was clean in the way that a bachelor household achieves cleanliness, which is to say that surfaces were cleared, but the deeper accumulations of years of solitary living were visible in the arrangement of things. The single chair drawn up close to the fire, the single place setting on the shelf, the book stacked by the hearth with no consideration for anything other than what he had been reading recently. There was a good iron stove, a solid table with 4 chairs around it that suggested he had once imagined company or intended to have it, a rag rug on the plank floor that had faded to pleasant, uncertain colors, and windows on 3 walls that let in the golden late afternoon light in bars across the floor. It was a room that wanted someone else in it. She could see that immediately. She sat down at the table while he built the fire up in the stove and set the coffee on, and she looked around at the details of a life that had been built carefully by one person and noticed, on the windowsill by the sink, a small bunch of wildflowers in a tin cup that had dried to papery softness, weeks old, the kind of thing a man put on a windowsill when he was expecting someone, and then left there, because removing it would have been admitting something he was not ready to admit. "Those are mine, I think," she said, nodding toward the flowers when he turned around. He followed her gaze. A muscle in his jaw moved. "I cut them on the 12th, he said, "when I thought you were coming." "You did not throw them out." "No," he said simply, and turned back to the coffee. They talked for 2 hours that first evening, across the wooden table with the coffee between them, the light changing from gold to amber to the deep blue of early evening as the July sun went down. They talked the way 2 people talk when they have been writing letters but have not yet heard each other's actual voices, testing the reality of the person against the image assembled from words on paper, discovering where the 2 things matched and where they were unexpectedly different. What matched? He was thoughtful and he listened fully before speaking, which was rare and which she valued. He was deeply interested in the practical functioning of the world, in how things were built and how they worked, in what the land was doing season by season. He was not a man who talked for the sake of filling silence, which meant that what he said tended to mean something. What was different from what she had expected? He was funnier than his letters had suggested. Not in a broad way, not in the way of the men she had known in Missouri who liked to hear themselves tell stories, but quietly, with a dry and observational humor that crept up on you before you noticed it was there. He made a remark about the hailstorm in May and the state of his barn roof that made her laugh genuinely before she had quite decided to, and she saw that it pleased him without him making any particular demonstration of being pleased. What she told him, that first evening, that she had not told him in the letters. Her mother had died in the autumn of 1877. Her father had died when she was 16. She had a sister in St. Louis, married and comfortable and kind, who had offered to let Myrtle come and live with them in a small and well-meaning way that had made clear that Myrtle would be a guest rather than a resident for as long as such an arrangement lasted. She had worked as a seamstress and as a bookkeeper in a dry goods store, and she was good at both, and she was not afraid of work, but she had wanted something of her own, not someone else's household, not someone else's life held open for her as a charity. She had wanted to build something. He listened to all of this without interrupting and without the careful sympathy that sometimes felt more like pity wearing a kind face. When she finished, he said, "I understand that feeling. Wanting something of your own. You have all this," she said, gesturing around at the house, the land implied by the windows and the darkness gathering outside them. "I built it alone," he said. "That is not the same as having it." He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands, and she understood that this was him saying something real rather than something performed. I came out here from Ohio in 1872. I was 24 years old and I had enough money to buy the land and the lumber and the seed and about nothing left over. I built this house in the summer and planted in the spring and lost most of the first crop to drought and made enough the second year to survive and more the third. By the time I was managing well enough that the work stopped being entirely about survival, I looked up and noticed I had been talking to myself and my horses for 3 years. "Was that when you placed the advertisement?" she asked. "Not immediately," he said. "I am not a man who moves quickly toward the obvious solution." "I noticed that about your letters," she said. "They took a long time to get to the point, but the point was always worth arriving at." He looked at her with that brief warmth again, the crack in the composure. "I could say the same about you," he said. "Arriving late but worth the wait." She felt heat in her face that was not embarrassment but something closer to its braver cousin. "You said on the porch that you had gotten better at waiting," she said. "The plains teach you that," he said. "You cannot rush a crop. You cannot rush the weather. You cannot rush the way the seasons turn. You learn to wait for what you want, or you drive yourself half out of your mind fighting something that is not going to change because you argue with it." He paused. 3 weeks felt like a long time, but I had the sense to know that if I gave up at 3 weeks, I would spend the next 3 years regretting it. Myrtle Maddox looked at Paul Shelby across the table in the lamplight and thought that she had made the right decision. She had not been entirely certain, even on the stage, even on the horse coming up the road, that she had made the right decision. She was certain now. The next morning she woke in the small spare room that he had evidently prepared for her arrival, a room with a clean-made bed, and a small chest of drawers, and a window that looked east across the plains toward the sunrise, which was happening in shades of pink and gold that made her lie still for several minutes just looking at it. The house was quiet but not empty quiet. She could hear the low sounds of morning, a horse in the corral, the distant call of some bird she could not yet identify, and underneath all of it the breathing of the wind across the grass. She got up and dressed and went to the kitchen to discover that Paul had already been up for 2 hours, that coffee was on the stove and eggs had been cracked into the skillet, and there was biscuit dough rising on the board. He looked up from the stove when she came in, and there was a brief, slightly self-conscious moment that belonged to two people who are still learning the shape of sharing a morning. "You cook," she said. "I have been feeding myself for 6 years," he said. "You learn what you need to." "I can take over that," she said, moving toward the stove. "You do not have to," he said. "Take your coffee first." She took her coffee and stood at the east window and watched the sun finish coming up over the plains while he cooked breakfast, and the domestic ease of the moment, the coffee and the morning light and the smell of eggs cooking, had such a quality of rightness about it that she felt something in her chest that she could not immediately name, though she thought it might be the beginning of happiness. They had a practical conversation over breakfast about the arrangements. He had been clear in his letters that he was a man of faith and had a settled intention to marry properly, and he raised the subject with a directness that she appreciated. There was a minister in Caldwell, a Reverend Whitmore, who had agreed to perform the ceremony when Myrtle arrived. The question was whether she was willing to proceed, given everything, given that she had only met him the previous afternoon. "I have known you for 2 months," she said. "The letters were real. I feel fairly certain of that." "They were real," he said. "Then I am willing," she said, "if you are." "I placed the advertisement," he said. "I would not have placed it if I was not willing." She smiled at him over her coffee cup. "You are a very literal man." "I prefer the word honest," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in the dry way she was already learning to watch for. They were married on July 7th, 1878, in the small white Methodist church in Caldwell, Kansas, with Clara Hatch and her husband Thomas as witnesses, and the Reverend Whitmore performing the ceremony with the brisk efficiency of a man who had done this many times and believed in it every time. Myrtle wore her second-best dress, which was actually her best dress because her best dress was the one she had been wearing when she arrived, and it needed washing after the journey. Paul wore a clean shirt and his good coat and had, she noticed, gotten his hair cut. When he put the ring on her finger, a plain gold band that he had made in Caldwell the previous month and had been carrying in his pocket for 3 weeks while he waited, she felt the solid weight of it with a feeling that settled over her like the beginning of belonging to something. He did not kiss her dramatically in the church. He kissed her once briefly, with a kind of careful tenderness that was somehow more moving than anything more theatrical would have been. And then they shook hands with the Reverend Whitmore and thanked the Hatches and walked out into the July sunshine as people who were, legally and practically and in their own minds, married to each other. Clara Hatch embraced Myrtle on the church steps with warm, practical arms. "You come to me if you need anything," she said. "This is not a bad place to build a life, but it is a hard one, and it helps to know people." Myrtle thanked her and meant it, and she and Paul rode back out to the ranch in the late morning sun, and it was the first of many rides they would take together along that road. The weeks that followed were the weeks of two people learning each other in real time rather than through letters, which is a considerably more complicated and more rewarding process. Myrtle threw herself into the work of the ranch with the competence and stubbornness that had kept her functioning through everything that had gone wrong between Missouri and Kansas, and she found that the work was hard but not impossible, and that it had the satisfying quality of being directly connected to outcomes you could see and touch and eat. She took over the garden, which Paul had maintained with practical sufficiency, but no real enthusiasm. The kitchen garden on the south side of the house had potatoes and beans, and some straggly tomato plants that needed attention. She got the beans staked properly, and the tomatoes tied and put in more rows of late summer greens that would come up in time for September eating. She found it meditative, the garden work, the close attention it required, the daily evidence of growth or trouble, the way it rooted you to a particular piece of ground. She also discovered that she had opinions about the organization of the house that Paul had not considered, because he had been living alone and therefore had no one to disagree with him. And she discovered that he was the kind of man who would hear an argument and change his mind if the argument was better than his original position, which she found admirable, and which also meant they had several productive arguments in the first month that ended with better arrangements than either of them had started with. She reorganized the pantry shelf by frequency of use rather than by size, which he conceded was more practical. He showed her how the water system worked, the pump and the pipes he had laid to bring water from the well to the kitchen, which he had built himself, and which was genuinely impressive engineering for a man who had taught himself as he went. She took over the accounts, which he had kept adequately but with the slight disorder of a man who understood numbers but did not find them interesting, and she found that the ranch was in sound financial shape, and that with better tracking it could be in better shape still, and she showed him this in a ledger one evening, and he looked at her with something close to wonder. "You are good at that," he said. "I told you I worked as a bookkeeper," she said. "I know. I did not quite understand what it meant until just now." She started writing with him on the ranch checks, learning the fences and the water sources and the grazing patterns of the cattle. He was a patient teacher in the practical matters, showing her things once clearly and waiting for her to understand rather than repeating himself with the slight impatience that characterized some teachers. She learned to ride properly in a few weeks because she had some experience from Missouri, and because she was not afraid of horses, and by August she could handle the fence-line checks on her own when he needed to be elsewhere. The cattle were mixed stock, mostly longhorns with some shorthorns he had been breeding in because he believed the market was moving toward beef cattle rather than range cattle, a judgment that she thought showed genuine understanding of where the territory was going. She knew enough about commerce from her bookkeeping work to understand that the Kansas railheads were changing the economics of everything, and that the ranchers who were thinking ahead now would be better positioned in 5 years. She told him this one evening, and he looked at her with that particular expression she had come to think of as his listening face, fully attending, fully present. "You have been thinking about the business of it," he said. "I think about everything," she said. "It is a habit I cannot break." "Do not try," he said. There were harder things, too, in those first weeks and months. There were times when the strangeness of what they had done caught up with both of them, when the sudden proximity of a person who had been a collection of written words 6 weeks ago felt enormous and requiring of navigation. There were evenings when conversation failed, and the silence filled up the room, and she was not yet sure enough of him to trust that the silence was comfortable rather than troubled. There was the night in late July when she woke at 2 in the morning with a grief for her mother so sharp and so sudden that it came out of her as sound before she could stop it, and she sat in her room with her hand over her mouth and tried to get herself quiet, and after a moment there was a soft knock at the door and Paul's voice saying, not intruding, just present, "Are you all right? I heard something." She opened the door and he stood in the hallway in the dark with his lamp and his honest face, and she said, "I am sorry I woke you," and he said, "Do not apologize, I was already awake." He did not ask her what was wrong in a way that demanded explanation. He simply carried his lamp to the kitchen and built the fire in the stove back up and made tea, which was not what she would have expected from him, and she sat at the table and held the cup and told him about her mother, which she had not done in any of the letters. She told him about the October afternoon when she had come home from the dry goods store and found her mother had gone quietly in her chair by the window, and the strange, terrible gentleness of it, and how the house had been so quiet afterward that she had started going to work earlier and coming home later just to avoid the hours when the quiet was worst. He listened to all of it, and then he said quietly, "My mother died in 1875. My father was already gone by then, so I have some understanding of what it is to be without parents and also to be alone with the knowledge of it." He paused. "It does not go away, but it changes. It becomes something you carry rather than something that carries you." It was not a thing she would have said herself, but it was true, and she felt the truth of it settle in her chest alongside the grief and make it marginally lighter. She looked at him across the table in the lamplight. This man she had married 3 weeks after agreeing to marry a stranger, and she thought, "I am glad I came here. I am glad the flood delayed me and the axle broke, and the fare dispute cost me a day and a half. I am glad I arrived 3 weeks late to a man who was still waiting." She did not say any of this aloud, but she thought it. August in Kansas was brutal in the way that summer can be brutal on the open plains, heat that sat on the land like a weight and did not lift even after dark, the air at midnight still warm enough to make sleeping uncomfortable. The grass went gold and the creek dropped, and Paul spent the mornings rotating the cattle between pastures to keep them on the better grass, and the afternoons doing the maintenance work on fences and equipment that the summer heat made necessary. Myrtle made friends with the town in August. She went in twice a week with Paul when he had business, and she made the kind of connections that women make in small frontier towns, the practical alliances of shared proximity and mutual need. Clara Hatch became a genuine friend, which she had suspected would happen from their first meeting. There was also a woman named Ruth Delaney who ran the millinery shop, and who was as interested in politics and the wider world as any man Myrtle had encountered in Missouri, which she found refreshing. And there was Me Pullins, whose husband ran the telegraph office, who had 3 children under 7, and the besieged cheerfulness of a person managing a great deal at once, and who seemed grateful for any adult conversation that was not specifically about children or cattle. Caldwell in 1878 was a town at the edge of a transformation that everyone could feel and nobody could entirely predict. The cattle trade had made it important and also rough in ways that the permanent residents had mixed feelings about. The Long Branch Saloon and its competitors brought money into the local economy, and also brought trouble, the particular kind of trouble that gathered where young men with cash and few social constraints congregated. Myrtle had grown up in a river city and was not sheltered from the realities of how men behaved under those circumstances, but she observed the dynamics of Caldwell with careful attention because it was now her town and she intended to understand it. She had a conversation with Paul in late August about the state of things in Caldwell and was gratified to find that he had thought carefully about the same questions she had. He had no love for the violence that the cattle trade brought in, but he was also a practical man and understood that the economics of the region were built on that trade and that simple condemnation was not a policy. "It changes," he said. "Towns either settle or they burn. Caldwell has more of the first kind of people than the second. It will settle." He was right about that, though it would take several more years than either of them knew in the summer of 1878. What she noticed in August, more than anything else, was the slow and steady way that she was falling in love with her husband. It was not the sudden dramatic thing that the stories described, the lightning bolt recognition of a soul mate, but something much more like the way a house becomes a home, through accumulation and time, and the thousand small things that happen when two people share their days honestly. It was the way he handed her things without being asked for them, after only a few weeks of domestic life together, because he paid attention to what she needed. It was the way he talked to his horses, not with the childish affection some people showed toward animals, but with a genuine regard, addressing them as thinking creatures whose moods and states were worth attending to. It was the way he read in the evenings, absorbed and quiet, and occasionally read something aloud to her, not because he thought she needed to hear it, but because it had struck him, and sharing a thing that strikes you is an act of intimacy. It was also, she admitted to herself with a frankness she had learned from him, the physical reality of him, the particular way he occupied space, the line of his jaw and the steadiness of his hands, and the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not looking back. She was usually looking back. She was sitting on the porch one evening in late August, the day's heat finally lifting into the blue dark of early night, when he came out and sat on the step beside her, closer than he usually sat, and they looked at the stars coming out over the plains, which was one of the daily miracles of that landscape. The way the stars appeared out here without the interference of city light, vast and close, and speaking of distances that made all human concerns seem simultaneously important and absurd. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "I told you when you arrived that I had been worried about you," he said. "That I had been writing letters to you for 2 months and knew you better than I knew most people nearby." He paused. "I want to tell you that it has gotten considerably more complicated than that in the past month and a half." Her heart was doing that thing again, the uncertain, complicated thing it had learned to do around him. "Has it?" she said, keeping her voice even. "I realize it has been a short time," he said. "And I realize the arrangement between us is still more practical than anything else, in theory. But I do not think it is, in practice, entirely practical anymore, and I thought you should know that." She looked at him in the starlight, his profile serious and a little tense, the composure not fully holding this time. "Paul," she said. "Yes. I have been in love with you for at least 3 weeks," she said. "I was just trying to work out whether it was too early to say so." The relief on his face was extraordinary. It changed him entirely, cracked all the composure at once, and what was underneath it was warm and young and entirely unguarded. He reached over and took her hand, not impulsively but deliberately, the way he did everything, and held it with a firmness that felt like a declaration. 3 weeks, he said. "Since the evening when you told me about your barn roof and the hailstorm," she said. "You made me laugh and then you made me feel at home in the same conversation, and that is not a common combination." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles with a formality that was somehow more tender than it would have been without the formality, and she felt the warmth of it run all the way up her arm and into the center of her chest, where she had been keeping this feeling since she first acknowledged it. "I am in love with you, Myrtle Maddox," he said, or Myrtle Shelby, as you prefer." "Myrtle Shelby," she said. "I have been practicing writing it." He laughed, a full real laugh, the kind she had been working to earn since she arrived, and she laughed with him. And somewhere over the plains, the night wind moved through the grass and a coyote called from a distant ridge, and it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. They kissed on the porch in the dark, not briefly this time and not with ceremony, but with the warmth and the honesty that characterized everything else between them. And the stars continued to come out over Kansas in their ancient quantities, entirely indifferent to, and somehow perfectly suited to the occasion. September brought the harvest and the work of it, which was comprehensive and exhausting, and also deeply satisfying in the way that work connected to your own survival tends to be. They worked side by side in the garden, canning and preserving for winter with a systematic thoroughness that Myrtle organized and Paul supplied with the muscular labor of carrying and lifting and chopping. The root cellar filled up with potatoes and turnips and winter squash, the pantry shelves with jars of tomatoes and beans, and preserved peaches from the tree on the south side of the property that had surprised her by bearing more fruit than she had expected. She found herself thinking, in September, about the women who had come before her to this land, the ones who had built lives here without the benefit of Clara, Hatch's friendship, or Paul's solid preparations. She had read enough to know that the frontier had not been kind to everyone who came to it, that the hardships were real and the losses were real, and that the romance of the thing was not the full story. She and Paul had a conversation about this one evening that went long and ranged widely, about the people who had been here before any of this, the Osage and the Wichita and the Comanche whose land this had been, and from whom it had been taken by a process that neither of them could describe with any real satisfaction as just, though they lived on the result of it every day. Paul was not a man who simplified things that were not simple. He said honestly that he did not know how to resolve the knowledge with the life, that he had thought about it and had no clean answer. "You live in a complicated inheritance," he said, "and you do what you can with what you have while trying not to pretend the complication is not there." She respected him more for refusing to pretend. In October, the cattle drive to the railhead took him away for 6 days, during which she ran the ranch alone, which was harder than she had expected and also more capable-making in the way that hard things done successfully tend to be. She fixed a fence section that the cattle had worked loose before they left, managed a situation with a blocked drainage ditch in the lower pasture, and finished the last of the autumn canning. When he came back from the drive with the payment for the cattle in his coat pocket and the particular lean-tired look of a man who had ridden hard for a week, she met him in the yard and he looked at her for a long moment before he even got off his horse and said, "You look like you have had an interesting week." "I fixed the south fence section," she said. He got down from his horse. "Which section?" "The one by the creek where the big cottonwood fell and pulled the wire." He looked at her. "That fence needed 3 posts replaced. How did you get the posts set?" "Slowly," she said, and with considerable language that I would not have used in other circumstances. He started to smile. "Did it hold?" "I tested it," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her against his side with the easy warmth that had become their natural mode of physical affection, unhurried and genuine, and she leaned into it and felt the solid reality of him after 6 days of his absence. "I missed you," she said. "I missed you every day," he said, which surprised me. "I have been alone a long time and I am used to it. I did not expect to notice the absence quite so much." "You noticed it. Every evening," he said. "The house I came back to in my head at the end of each day on the trail was not the house I have been living in for 6 years. It was the house it is now." She held onto that sentence for a long time. The house it is now. She understood that he meant not the building but the quality of it, the thing that changed when 2 people who loved each other inhabited a space together, the way a house becomes more than the sum of its walls and floors. The money from the cattle drive paid off the last of the bank note he had taken for the spring planting, and left enough over to think about some improvements that he had been considering for years. They sat together at the kitchen table with the ledger and the cash, and talked through the options the way two people talk when the planning is genuinely shared, when both people's knowledge and judgment are on the table equally. He wanted to expand the barn. She wanted a second well dug closer to the kitchen garden, which was currently dependent on hauling water from the pump. They discussed both, ran the numbers both ways, and decided to do the kitchen well first because it would reduce her daily labor immediately and save time that could be spent on other things, and to expand the barn in the spring when the ground was workable. He hired a man named Gabriel Morse to dig the well in late October, a compact and weather-hardened man of 50 who had been digging wells across Kansas for 20 years and who worked with a speed and competence that was a pleasure to watch. The well was done in 4 days, and Myrtle stood over it the first morning it was finished and drew a bucket of clean water and drank it standing right there in the garden in the October sun, and felt a satisfaction that was entirely disproportionate to the occasion and entirely genuine. "Worth it?" Paul asked from the garden gate. "You have no idea," she said. November settled over the plains with the particular weight of the season, the light going flat and cold, and the grass fading from gold to pale brown, the morning starting hard with frost that whitened everything to the horizon. Myrtle had been warned about Kansas winters and was not entirely unprepared for them, but the reality of the cold when it came had a solidity that description did not quite capture. The days shortened dramatically, and the nights came early and long and very dark. But the winters on the plains had their own beauty, she discovered, the kind of harsh and honest beauty that does not comfort but speaks plainly to what endures. The stars were even more extraordinary in winter, the cold air stripping away anything that might have softened them, laying the sky out in brilliant precision. On the clearest nights she and Paul sometimes stood on the porch wrapped in their coats and watched the sky for an hour, not saying much, which was one of the forms of intimacy she had come to value most in their marriage, the comfortable silence that did not need to be filled. She had been thinking about the spring in November, about what she wanted to plant and how to expand the kitchen garden, about whether they had put up enough fodder for the cattle through the winter, about the ledger and the projected income for the following year. She had been thinking about the future in a way that surprised her with its ease. She had come to Kansas uncertain, 3 weeks late and braced for rejection, and now she was planning springs ahead as though the ground under her feet had always been hers. In December she realized she was expecting a baby. She sat with the knowledge for 2 days before she told Paul, not because she was afraid to tell him, but because she wanted a moment to hold it herself first, to know what she thought and felt before the knowing became shared. What she found, when she examined the feeling carefully, was that it was primarily joy, clean and uncomplicated, underneath the ordinary physical uncertainty. She told him on a Sunday evening in December, the stove warm and the lamp lit against the early dark, the two of them sitting with their books in the comfortable domestic arrangement that had become the pattern of their evenings. She put down her book and said, "I have something to tell you," and he put down his book and looked at her with that full attention that she had come to know and love. When she told him, the expression on his face went through several things in rapid succession, all of them visible and none of them composed. She saw surprise, and then the dissolution of surprise into something much larger, and then something that she could only describe as a kind of quiet, overwhelmed joy that he sat with for a long moment before he said anything. What he said when he said something was, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling well," she said. "I felt a little poorly in the mornings, but nothing serious." He came and sat beside her on the settee close and took her hands in both of his, and she could feel that his hands were not entirely steady. "We are going to have a child," he said, as though the saying of it made it more real. "We are," she said. "Sometime in the summer, I think. July, perhaps." "July," he said. He looked at her with his honest face full of everything he was feeling and not hiding any of it. "1 year after you arrived." She had not made that calculation yet, 1 year, she said, almost exactly. He put his forehead against hers, the gesture so tender and so unperformed that it caught in her throat, and said, "Myrtle." "Paul," she said. "I am very glad you came," he said. "I am very glad you were still here when I arrived," she said. He kissed her and the stove crackled, and outside the December wind moved across the Kansas plains in the way it had always done, vast and indifferent and somehow exactly right. The winter passed. They managed the cold and the isolation with the competence of people who had made their peace with hard things, and with the particular ease that comes from having someone to share the managing with. Paul repaired equipment and maintained the barn, and kept the water sources from freezing over. Myrtle kept the house and the books, and made a set of curtains for the bedroom window that let in the pale winter light, while keeping the cold out better than the bare panes had done, and started a quilt out of pieces of fabric she had brought from Missouri and pieces from Clara Hatch's generosity, a project that occupied the long winter evenings and took shape slowly into something beautiful. Clara came out to the ranch once in January and twice in February, making the 4-mile ride in cold that required considerable commitment, and Myrtle valued each visit more than she could easily express. There were things she needed to talk about, regarding the pregnancy and the realities of the spring, that required a woman who had been through these things before. Clara had 3 adult children, and had made the same journey with all 3 in circumstances considerably more primitive than Myrtle's present ones, and she spoke about it with the direct practicality that Myrtle had come to expect and rely on. "You will want to arrange for the doctor from Caldwell to come out in the summer," Clara said in February over tea at the kitchen table. "Or you can go into town when the time gets close. I would go into town, Mrs. Haggerty on Pine Street takes in women near their time, and the doctor is good." "Paul will want to be nearby," Myrtle said. "He can stay at the boarding house," Clara said. "He will pace holes in the floor there just as well as here, and you will be more comfortable with Mrs. Haggerty nearby." Myrtle smiled. "You have done this before." "I have helped with it before," Clara said. 3 times of my own and a good many of other women since. The West does not always give you what you need exactly when you need it, but the women here have gotten good at making sure nobody goes through things entirely alone. That was, Myrtle thought, one of the truest things she had heard about the frontier. The spring came in with the usual Kansas drama of variable weather, warm days and then a late freeze and then warm again, the grass greening up from the south first, and working its way north across the plains in a wave of color that never failed to move her regardless of how many times she saw it. She expanded the kitchen garden considerably, with help from Paul, who had the upper body strength to turn the heavy spring soil with a thoroughness her arms could not quite manage, especially as the pregnancy advanced, and she was more conscious of what she could safely do. He was, she discovered, going to be one of those husbands who worried. Not in a smothering way, not in the way that reduced a woman to a passive object of concern, but in the steady, attentive way of someone who cared about a specific person's well-being and showed it through practical action. He adjusted his schedule so that the heaviest lifting was done when he was nearby to do it rather than when she was managing alone. He built up the stock of firewood earlier than usual so that she would not need to carry it herself. He made sure the coffee was always on when she came in from the garden because he had noticed, without her saying anything, that it helped with the morning unpleasantness. She told him one morning in April that she was grateful for the way he cared for her without it becoming managing her, and he looked at her with that direct expression and said, "You are capable of managing yourself. I'm just trying to make the circumstances easier." "That is exactly the right distinction," she said. "I learned it from watching you," he said. "You do not treat me as someone who needs to be managed either. You treat me as someone who can manage and offer help alongside it." She thought about that for a while and decided he was right, and that they had been teaching each other how to love each other well for the past 9 months in ways neither of them had quite articulated. In May, Paul hired a second ranch hand for the summer and fall season, a young man named Eli Covington, who had come west from Tennessee 3 years ago and had been working around the county since. He was 20 years old and earnest and not particularly experienced, but he was willing and he worked hard, and Paul had the patience and the competence to teach him what he needed to know. Eli Covington was the kind of young man who was improved by being given responsibility and who visibly grew into it over the summer, and Myrtle found him easy to like. He called her Mrs. Shelby with a formality that she did not correct because she thought he needed it more than she found it amusing, and he was unfailingly helpful in the small daily ways that cost nothing and signify a great deal. By June, he was managing the morning cattle checks reliably enough that Paul could sleep in on occasional mornings, which turned out to matter more than either of them had expected, because the spring planting had been intensive, and Paul was more tired than he usually admitted. June in Kansas was hot and green, and full of the particular energy that comes when the land is at the height of its growing season, everything in the garden pressing upward with an urgency that felt almost aggressive. Myrtle was, by June, substantially pregnant, and managing it with the same practical directness she brought to everything else, acknowledging what she could and could not do without drama and adjusting accordingly. She was still doing the books and the household management and the lighter garden work, and riding into Caldwell twice a week, though Paul had started accompanying her on those rides rather than letting her make them alone, which she did not object to. Clara had recommended they go into town in early July, and they had arranged it, but the baby, as it turned out, had its own schedule. It was the 28th of June, the evening of a day that had been hot even by Kansas standards, when it became apparent that the arrangement was advancing ahead of schedule. Paul had the horse saddled within 15 minutes, and they made the 4 miles to Caldwell in the dark faster than they had ever made them, Myrtle sitting behind him with her arms around him and her face against his back, and both of them talking steadily in the way people talk when what they are actually communicating is reassurance rather than information. Mrs. Haggerty was awake, because Mrs. Haggerty was always awake when she was needed, which was one of the things about her that made her indispensable. She had the spare room ready in under 5 minutes, and the doctor was roused from his house 2 streets over, and Clara Hatch, sent for by Paul the moment they arrived, appeared at the door in her coat over her nightgown with the expression of a woman who had been expecting this and was entirely prepared. Paul was, as Clara had predicted, at the boarding house pacing holes in the floor. He had left Myrtle with Clara and Mrs. Haggerty and the doctor, and had done so at Myrtle's own instruction, which she had delivered with characteristic directness during a lucid moment on the way in. "Go wait," she had said. "I will be perfectly all right. Go wait somewhere that is not underfoot." He had gone, but he had not slept. Their son was born at 4 in the morning on the 29th of June, 1879, healthy and loud and expressing his opinions about having arrived with considerable vigor. He was brought into the world by the doctor and by Clara Hatch, who had been through this often enough to be the steadiest person in the room, and Myrtle survived it as women survive it, by being stronger than any reasonable expectation would suggest. When Paul came in at 5 in the morning, because Clara had sent the doctor's boy to the boarding house the moment things were settled, he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son, with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. He put his hand very gently on the baby's head and looked up at Myrtle with eyes that were not quite dry, and said nothing for a moment, and she understood that this was one of the times when a man who chose his words carefully simply did not have words. "I was thinking," she said quietly, "of the name Thomas, after your father." He swallowed. His father's name had been Thomas, which she knew from the second letter, the one where he had talked about learning carpentry from his father as a boy. He had not said anything about naming a child after him, and she had not raised it before, wanting to keep it for this moment. "Thomas Shelby," he said. "If you like," she said. "I like it very much," he said. He reached for her hand with his free hand, the other one still resting gently on their son's head, and held it. "Thank you," he said. "For which part?" she said. He smiled, the full, warm smile that she had been earning since July of the previous year, the one that changed everything. "All of it," he said. For coming late and expecting to be turned away and coming anyway. For every letter and every conversation and every morning at the kitchen table. For this, he looked at the baby. For Thomas. She held his hand and looked at him across the morning light coming into Mrs. Haggerty's spare room. At this man she had agreed to marry before she had met him and had arrived to meet 3 weeks late, and had fallen in love with over coffee and fence repairs and cattle drives and long evenings reading by the stove. And she thought, this is the life I came west to build. This, exactly this. The summer of 1879 was different from the summer of 1878 in all the ways that a year and a marriage and a child make things different. The ranch was busier and louder and required more of everything, time and energy and patience and planning. Thomas Shelby turned out to be a person of strong preferences and enthusiastic communication, which Myrtle found both exhausting and completely fascinating. Paul was the kind of father she had suspected he would be from the evidence of how he treated other things he was responsible for, steady and attentive and patient in the way that genuine interest rather than obligation produces. Eli Covington stayed on through the second summer, and then asked Paul in the fall if there might be a permanent position, and Paul said yes without hesitation, because Eli had become genuinely capable, and because the ranch had grown enough over the past year that the extra pair of hands was not a luxury but a necessity. Eli Covington slept in the bunkroom that Paul built onto the barn that October, a small, comfortable room with a stove and a window that looked west, and became as much a part of the permanent landscape of the place as the cottonwood tree by the creek. In the fall of 1879, Paul bought the adjacent parcel of land from a family that had been broken by the drought of the previous year and was returning east, a hard and painful circumstance for them that he did not minimize, but that was nonetheless an opportunity he could not pass up. The additional land gave him more grazing range and access to a second water source, and it changed the scale of the operation from a moderate working ranch to something that, managed well, could be genuinely prosperous. He came home the evening he had signed the papers and put the deed on the kitchen table and looked at it and then at Myrtle, who had Thomas on her hip and flour on her apron from the biscuits she was making, and said, "I keep thinking about where I was 5 years ago." She put Thomas down on the rag rug where he had recently discovered the ability to sit up with considerable satisfaction. "And where were you 5 years ago?" she said. "Running this ranch alone," he said. "Making it work but not making much more than that, not planning much further than the next season." He looked at the deed and then at her. "I did not quite believe 5 years ago that it could look like this." "Like what?" she said, though she knew. "Like something I am building with someone," he said. "Like a future rather than just a continuation." She came and stood beside him and looked at the deed on the table, and he put his arm around her, and Thomas on the rug said something emphatic in the language of 1-year-olds that neither of them could interpret, but that seemed to be registering an opinion about the general proceedings. "He agrees," Myrtle said. Paul laughed. "He always has opinions." "He gets that from you," she said. "He gets everything interesting from you," he said, and kissed her temple. The years that followed built on each other with the organic logic of lives that are growing in the right direction. The ranch expanded, carefully and sustainably, Paul's methodical approach to the business keeping the growth manageable and the finances stable. Myrtle's management of the accounts grew into something more substantial as the operation grew, and she found herself, by the early 1880s, effectively functioning as the business partner she had been since the beginning, but with a scope that reflected the ranch's increased scale. They had a second child in 1881, a daughter they named Eleanor after Myrtle's mother, a child who arrived with considerably better timing than Thomas had, and who demonstrated from very early on a personality entirely her own, quieter than her brother, but with a watchfulness that suggested she was taking in considerably more than she was saying. Paul was besotted with Eleanor in a way that he demonstrated with uncharacteristic openness, carrying her on his shoulder in the mornings when he was doing his rounds near the house, showing her the horses with the patient introductory manner he used for things he thought were worth being introduced to properly. Thomas, at 2.5, treated his sister with the combination of proprietary pride and occasional incomprehension that characterized his general approach to things he had not yet fully understood, and Myrtle watched her children with the kind of love that had surprised her with its intensity from the moment Thomas was born, a love that was not like any other kind of love, that lived in a different part of you and demanded different things. Clara Hatch delivered Eleanor because the doctor was occupied with a situation on the other side of town, and Clara was there and knew exactly what she was doing, and Myrtle trusted her completely. Paul was in the house this time rather than the boarding house, because Myrtle had changed her mind about that detail, not wanting the 4 miles between them if anything went wrong. He stayed downstairs and kept the stove going and Thomas occupied, and when Clara came down and told him he had a daughter, the look on his face was the look she had seen in Mrs. Haggerty's spare room 2 years before, and it was the same this time, that large and unguarded joy. In the summer of 1882, Caldwell began to change in the ways that Paul had predicted. The worst of the cattle trade violence had run its course, not because anything had fundamentally changed in human nature, but because the town had grown enough permanent residents and enough institutional structure that the balance had shifted. There was a proper school now, which mattered to Myrtle considerably, and a larger church, and a women's auxiliary that she joined and found more practically useful than its title suggested, because the women who ran it were the kind of women who organized things and got them done without waiting for permission from anyone. She gave a small speech at the auxiliary meeting in September of 1882 about the need for a proper town library, and was startled to find herself taken seriously in a way that led, within the year, to an actual library in a donated room at the back of the Caldwell Community Hall, stocked with books donated by every literate household in a 40-mile radius. It was not a large library, not yet, but it was a library, and she had helped make it happen, and that satisfied something in her that she had not known needed satisfying. She told Paul about it that evening, the meeting and the speech and the response, and he listened with the full attention she had come to rely on and then said, "Why did that surprise you, that they took you seriously?" She thought about it. "I am not sure," she said. "Force of habit, perhaps." "You should stop being surprised by that," he said. "You are the most capable person I know. I recognized it before I met you from the letters. The only person who seems uncertain of it is you." She looked at him steadily. "You were not always certain of it in Ohio when you were building this alone." "That is different," he said. "Is it?" He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "it is not." "You are right." He paused. "We are both more certain of ourselves than we were before." "Because of each other," she said. "Because of each other," he agreed. Thomas started school in the fall of 1883, marching into the Caldwell schoolhouse on the first day with the confidence of a child who has been told, consistently and by both parents, that the world is interesting and that learning about it is one of the best things you can do with your time. He was 5 years old and fiercely curious, and the teacher, a young woman named Miss Abbott from Ohio, wrote in the first monthly report that Thomas Shelby had asked more questions in his first week than she had received from the rest of the class combined, and that this was mostly a positive indicator. Myrtle read this report to Paul at the kitchen table, and they both laughed, and she wrote back to Miss Abbott thanking her for her patience and encouraging her to direct Thomas's questions toward productive channels whenever possible. Eleanor, at 2, was beginning to talk in full sentences, a development that surprised no one who had been paying attention, and was discovering a passionate interest in horses that appeared to be entirely her own preference rather than any parental influence, since she had been expressing it by pointing urgently at horses and saying, "Mine," since she could first point. Paul had started letting her sit in the saddle in front of him for the short morning rides near the house, holding her securely while she looked out at the world from that elevation, with an expression of profound satisfaction. In the evenings, in the house that was theirs and full of children and books and the accumulated evidence of a life built together, Myrtle sometimes sat on the porch in the warm weather, listening to the plains in the dark, and thought about the woman who had stepped off that stagecoach 5 years ago with a crumpled letter and a carpet bag, and the certainty that she was going to be turned away. She thought about how she had squared her shoulders against that certainty and walked across the street to ask for directions anyway, because what she had was the letter and the letters and the belief that the person who had written them was worth the rest of the journey. She thought about Paul standing in the barn doorway, watching her come, with an expression she had not been able to read. She knew now what the expression had been. She had asked him, sometime in the second year, what he had been thinking, standing there in the barn doorway while she rode up the track toward him 3 weeks late and clearly braced for rejection. He had thought about it for a moment and then said, "I was thinking that you looked exactly like I expected you to look." Which surprised me because I had only imagined you from the letters. But you rode up that track as though you belonged there, even though you were clearly terrified, and I thought, "There she is." "There she is," she had repeated. "Like I had been waiting for a specific person rather than a general idea," he said. "And there you were." She carried that with her. There she was. On their 5th anniversary in July of 1883, Paul did something that she had not expected from him, which was to write her a letter. He left it on the kitchen table the evening before the anniversary, folded and addressed to her in the careful hand she had known from the beginning, and she found it in the morning when she came down to make the coffee. She sat at the table with her coffee and read it, and it was the best letter he had ever written, which was a high standard, because his letters had always been worth arriving at. He had written about the 5 years in a way that did not make a simple story of them, but held the truth of them whole, the difficulty and the beauty, and the daily accumulating evidence of what they were building together. He had written about Thomas and Alina and the ranch and the library and the porch conversations, and the evenings reading and the winters and the springs and the cattle drives, and the fence she had set alone, and the well by the kitchen garden, and the dried wildflowers on the windowsill that had been there when she arrived. He had written, at the end, "I told you on the porch that evening in August of 1878 that I was in love with you. That was true, and I meant every word of it. But I want you to know that it has gotten considerably more complicated than that over the past 5 years, and I mean that in the very best possible way. I love you the way I love this land, which is to say without any real capacity to imagine my life organized differently, and with a gratitude that is not always well expressed but is always present. Thank you for being 3 weeks late. Thank you for coming anyway." She sat at the kitchen table in the July morning with the letter in her hands and the coffee going cold, and the sounds of her children beginning to stir upstairs. And she was quietly and completely happy in the particular way that a well-made life makes you happy when you stop to look at it squarely. He came in from the morning check of the horses and found her there, and she looked up at him, and whatever he saw in her face made him stop in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand and simply look at her. "Good letter," he said. "Good letter," she said. He came and sat beside her, and she leaned against him, and outside the July morning was doing all the things July mornings in Kansas did, the heat building from the east, the meadowlarks going in the grass, the plains stretching out in every direction to a horizon that was clear and true and full of the particular promise of a day in the middle of a good life. The years continued to build. The ranch grew into something that their children would inherit and that their grandchildren would perhaps grow up on. A piece of land, and a way of life that had been made by two people who had come to it honestly and carefully, and who had had the sense to trust each other. Paul put a second porch on the north side of the house in 1884, because Myrtle had mentioned once that the north light in the evenings was beautiful, and that it was a shame there was nowhere to sit in it. And he had filed the remark away and built the porch the following summer without announcing the plan. And she came around the corner of the house one August afternoon and found it there complete, with 2 chairs and a small table, and stood looking at it for a long moment. He came out of the barn and watched her discover it and said nothing. She turned around. "Paul Shelby," she said. "Yes," he said. "You built me a porch," she said. "You mentioned the north light," he said. "I mentioned it once," she said. "8 months ago." "I remember most of what you say," he said, with the dry corner-of-the-mouth expression that she had loved since the first week. "It is a character flaw." She went and kissed him in the yard in the August sunlight, and Eli Covington, coming out of the barn behind him, took a sudden interest in the distant fence line. Thomas Shelby grew up knowing the ranch the way you know a place you were born to, with the bone-deep familiarity that is also, as you get older, wonder. He was quick and curious and grew tall like his father, with his mother's brown eyes and her habit of thinking before speaking that made him seem older than he was. He read everything the Caldwell library acquired, which was Myrtle's doing and which she felt was one of the more satisfying outcomes of her library project. He went with his father on the cattle drive starting at 9, learning the work from the inside, and he came back from each one with stories and questions that would occupy the family table for the first week he was home. Eleanor was, from early childhood, a person of particular clarity. She knew what she wanted and was direct about it in a way that her parents recognized and respected. And what she wanted, from the age she could coherently express a preference, was to be on horses and outside, and involved in the actual running of the ranch rather than the domestic side of it, which she made clear with the polite firmness of someone who has thought about this carefully. Myrtle had a conversation with her about this when Eleanor was 7, a serious and considered conversation that she thought was important to have. She told Eleanor that there was no version of her life in which she could not be both someone who rode and worked the land and someone who ran a household competently, because those things were not opposites, and the false choice between them was something other people might try to impose, but that was not, in Myrtle's experience, a real constraint if you refused to accept it. Eleanor listened to this with the watchful concentration that characterized her, and then said, "Mrs. Abbott says girls should keep house." "Mrs. Abbott keeps house and teaches school," Myrtle said. "She is doing both. Many women here do many things because the frontier requires it and because they are capable of it. You are capable of anything you choose to commit to. Do not let anyone persuade you that your choices are smaller than they actually are." Eleanor thought about this and then nodded once with the manner of someone filing a thing for future reference. She then went back outside to the horses. Paul, who had been in the kitchen hearing this exchange without comment, looked at his wife with that full, warm expression and said, "She is going to be someone remarkable." "She already is," Myrtle said. "They both are." In the summer of 1885, Myrtle was 31 years old and Paul was 37. And they had been married for 7 years, and the life they had built was solid and warm and full of the accumulated texture of years of daily love. The ranch was prospering in the way that ranches prosper when they are run with intelligence and patience over a long time, not dramatically but sustainably, each year building on the last. The library in Caldwell had a proper room of its own now, and a budget from the town council, and Myrtle served on its board, which took her into town every 2 weeks for meetings that she found genuinely satisfying. Clara Hatch's husband Thomas died in the spring of 1885 after a brief illness, and Clara was a widow at 57, and Myrtle made the 4 miles between their houses in the other direction frequently in the months that followed, sitting with Clara in her kitchen, helping with things that needed doing, being present in the way that Clara had been present for her since the first day she arrived in Caldwell. The friendship had deepened over 7 years into something fundamental. One of those friendships that women make on the frontier that endure because they are built from genuine need and genuine regard in equal measure. She thought, on one of those visits to Clara in the autumn of 1885, about the woman who had handed her peppermints and told her that Paul Shelby checked the stage twice a week and was one of the most patient men in the county. She thought about how much of her life had pivoted on that conversation and on the advice it had led her to take. "Clara," she said, over tea in Clara's kitchen. "Yes," Clara said. "I want to thank you for what you did when I arrived," Myrtle said. "The water and the peppermints and the information about Paul. I was standing in that street in July of 1878, very close to simply getting back on the stage and going home." "I know," Clara said. "I could see it on your face. You sent me out to him anyway." "I could also see that you were exactly the right person for him," Clara said. "And I could see that he had been waiting for a specific person, not just anyone, and I thought it would be a shame for you both if you missed each other by a bad decision made while you were tired and scared." She smiled. "Besides, you have the look of someone who gets braver when they are afraid, not less brave. I thought if I gave you a moment and some water, you would figure out the right direction." Myrtle looked at her friend. "You were right." "I usually am," Clara said, with the serene confidence of a woman who had earned the right to say so. On the evening of July 7th, 1885, which was their 7th wedding anniversary, Paul and Myrtle Shelby sat on the north porch in the evening light that she had mentioned once, and that he had built her a porch to sit in. Thomas was inside, reading the 3rd volume of a history of the American West that his mother had ordered from a bookseller in St. Louis for his birthday. Alina was in the barn, which was where Alina was most evenings by preference, communing with the horses in whatever private language she and they had developed between them. The plains were doing what the plains did in early July evenings, the grass gone gold in the late light, the sky performing its slow transition from blue to the deep colors of approaching sunset, the wind moving steadily from the south and carrying the warm green smell of summer and the distant sweet smell of the hay that Paul had cut in the east pasture that week. He had her hand in both of his, the way he sometimes did when they sat together, not dramatically, just the comfortable claiming of a thing he valued. "7 years, he said. 7 years, she said, and 3 weeks. He looked at her. 3 weeks. "You told me you had gotten better at waiting," she said. "I have always counted the 3 weeks as part of it." He considered this. "That is fair," he said. 7 years and 3 weeks. "You were right, you know," she said. "About what specifically?" he said, with the dry quality that would never entirely leave him no matter how warm he became and that she would love until the last day of her life. "About what you said on the porch that first August, about learning to wait, about the plains teaching you that you cannot rush things." She looked out at the land in the evening light. "I did not understand it when you said it. I thought I did, but I understood it intellectually rather than the way you meant it. I understand it now." "What changed?" He said. She thought about how to say it. "Everything we have here," she said. "The ranch and the children and the library and Clara and all of it. None of it happened quickly. None of it happened in a rush. It is all the product of time and patience and showing up every day and doing the work and trusting that the slow accumulation of small things produces something real." She paused. "That is what you meant. You meant that good things take the time they take and the waiting is not wasted, it is part of it." He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him thinking the way she had learned to feel it. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what I meant." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles in the gesture he had first made on the porch in 1878, the same gesture that had moved her then and moved her still. "You have gotten better at waiting, too." "I had a good teacher," she said. The sun was going down over the Kansas plains, painting the sky in the colors that Paul had described in his first letter before she had ever seen them, the colors she had read about and imagined, and then arrived to find exceeded the imagining, as the real things almost always exceed their descriptions when the descriptions are honest. The meadowlarks were going quiet one by one as the light faded. From the barn came the sound of Aliner's voice, talking to a horse in the steady, comfortable tone of someone conducting a conversation they expect to be meaningful. Thomas came to the door and looked out at them. "Mother," he said, "what is for supper?" "Whatever your father decides to cook," Myrtle said without turning around. "I thought you were cooking," Paul said. "It is our anniversary," she said. "I am sitting on the porch you built me. You are cooking." Thomas took in this information and disappeared back inside. There was a pause. "That seems fair," Paul said. "I generally find that I am fair," she said. He stood up, released her hand with the reluctance of a man who would rather have stayed, and went inside. And she heard him at the stove and heard Thomas asking him something about something entirely unrelated to supper, and heard Paul answering with the patience that he brought to all of Thomas's questions. And the sounds of the kitchen in the evening came through the door behind her, while the plains went from gold to the deep rose of approaching dark. She thought about all the evenings there had been, and all the evenings there would be. This particular combination of people in this particular place, built over 7 years and 3 weeks from a letter and a conversation and a willingness to arrive and not turn back. She thought about her mother and Paul's father and the people who were gone and the people still here, and about Thomas reading inside and Aliner in the barn and Paul at the stove. She thought about Clara Hatch and Eli Covington and the north porch and the kitchen well, and the peppermints she had never actually given to Paul because she had eaten one on the way out to the ranch and then felt too self-conscious to produce the rest. She had told him about the peppermints eventually, a year after the fact, and he had laughed for a long time. The stars were beginning to come out. The first one appeared directly over the horizon, the evening star, and then the others came in sequence, and the sky deepened and filled and became the Kansas night sky that she had watched hundreds of times from this land, and that she thought she would never entirely take for granted. Myrtle Shelby sat on her north porch in the July dark and listened to the supper being made inside and the horses in the barn and the wind in the grass, and she was, in the full and quiet way of someone who has built the life they wanted and knows it, and is not taking it for granted, happy. She had arrived 3 weeks late, expecting to be turned away. She had found a man who had simply gotten better at waiting. Everything else had been the years and the work, and the daily ordinary miracle of 2 people who loved each other, sharing their lives with honesty and patience and the willingness to show up. That was, she thought, enough. That was, in fact, everything.